The arrival terminal was crowded with military families holding flags, balloons, and handmade welcome signs. Claire Whitmore stood quietly near the front, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. 14 months had passed since she had last hugged her husband, Captain Ethan Calloway. She had imagined this reunion hundreds of times. She imagined Ethan smiling the way he always had before deployment. Instead, when he walked through the automatic doors, she barely recognized him. His uniform was perfectly pressed. His medals shined under the airport lights. But his face carried a heaviness she had never seen before. Claire ran toward him and wrapped her arms around him. For a brief moment he hugged her back. Then he slowly stepped away. "I'm glad you're safe," she whispered. Ethan forced a small smile. "So am I." The drive home felt strangely quiet. Claire talked about the neighbors, the new coffee shop that had opened nearby, and the flowers she had planted in the backyard. Ethan listened without saying much. Every answer was short. Every smile disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. When they reached home, Ethan carried his bag upstairs and closed the bedroom door. Claire stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the dinner she had spent hours preparing. She told herself he simply needed time. The following weeks became even more difficult. Ethan rarely slept through the night. Sometimes Claire woke up to find his side of the bed empty. She would look through the window and see him sitting alone on the back porch long before sunrise. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking on the phone. He simply sat there in complete silence, staring into the darkness. Whenever Claire asked if something was wrong, he gave the same answer. "I've fine." She knew he wasn't. One Saturday, hoping to make him smile again, Claire recreated their very first date. She cooked homemade pasta, lit candles around the dining room, and played the same jazz record they had danced to years earlier. When Ethan walked downstairs, he stopped in the doorway. For a second, Claire thought everything would be okay. Instead, he quietly turned around and walked back upstairs. A few moments later, she heard the bedroom door close. She sat alone at the table until the candles burned out. The next morning, Ethan apologized. "I'm sorry." Claire looked at him. "You don't have to apologize. Just tell me what's hurting you." He looked down at the floor. "I don't know how." Days turned into weeks. Claire noticed a pattern. Every Thursday evening, Ethan left the house at exactly 7 o'clock. He always returned a few hours later. He never explained where he went. One Thursday, curiosity finally overcame her. She waited until his truck disappeared around the corner, then quietly followed him. After 20 minutes, Ethan parked outside a small brick building with a simple sign that read Veterans Recovery Center. Claire stayed inside her car, watching him walk through the front door. Nearly 2 hours passed before he came back outside. He wasn't alone. Several other veterans walked out with him. Some laughed. Some shook hands. Ethan smiled politely at them, but the smile vanished the moment he reached his truck. Claire drove home before he did. That night, she wanted to tell him she knew where he had been. Instead, she remained silent. She had the feeling that whatever Ethan was carrying inside him was far heavier than anything she could imagine. The following Friday, Claire received a call from the military base. The officer on the phone invited her to attend an awards ceremony honoring Ethan for extraordinary bravery during his final deployment. She smiled politely and thanked him. When Ethan returned home that evening, she asked him about it. "I got a call from the base today." He froze for a moment. "They're giving you another medal." Ethan quietly took off his jacket and hung it by the door. "It doesn't matter." Claire looked at him in disbelief. "How can it not matter? They're honoring you." "They're honoring a mission," he replied. "Not me." That answer stayed with Claire all night. A week later, they attended the ceremony together. Military families filled the auditorium. One by one, soldiers walked across the stage to receive awards for courage and leadership. When Captain Ethan Calloway's name echoed through the hall, everyone stood and applauded. The commanding general praised him for leading his unit through an enemy ambush and bringing 11 soldiers home safely. As the applause continued, Ethan accepted the medal without smiling. He thanked the general with a handshake and immediately stepped away from the stage. There was no speech. No celebración. When they returned home, Claire found the medal still inside its velvet case, untouched on the kitchen counter. She picked it up carefully. You should be proud of this. Ethan looked at the medal for several seconds before speaking. There was supposed to be a 12th man. Claire slowly lowered the box. What do you mean? Ethan remained silent. She realized she had asked the wrong question at the wrong time. That night neither of them slept very well. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Claire woke to the sound of someone breathing heavily. She hurried downstairs. Ethan was standing in the living room, staring toward the front window. His face was covered in sweat. His hands were trembling. It happened again, he whispered. Claire gently guided him to the couch. What happened? I saw him. Who? Ethan closed his eyes. Corporal Mason Reed. The name meant nothing to Claire. He served under my command. Ethan's voice cracked. He was 24 years old. He had a wife. A little girl who had just turned 3. Claire quietly held his hand. He trusted every decision I made. Ethan swallowed hard. On our final mission, I gave the order to move forward. He paused for several seconds. I thought the road had already been cleared. It wasn't. The explosion happened before anyone could warn us. Claire could hear the pain in every word. He pushed another soldier out of the blast. He saved his friend's life. But he couldn't save his own. The room fell silent. Ethan stared at the floor. Everyone keeps calling me a hero because 11 soldiers came home. He looked up at Claire, tears filling his eyes. But every time someone thanks me for my service, all I can think about is the one family that never got their husband and father back. Claire finally understood why her husband refused to celebrate. The medals, the applause, the ceremonies, none of them erased the memory he carried every single day. She wrapped her arms around him without saying a word. For the first time since he had returned home, Ethan didn't pull away. He simply sat there, holding his wife as years of buried grief finally began to surface. The conversation that night changed something between them. For the first time since Ethan had returned home, Claire understood that his silence wasn't a lack of love. It was the weight of guilt. The next morning, she quietly made breakfast. They ate together without forcing a conversation. Sometimes silence was kinder than questions. A few days later, Ethan received another call from the military base. His former unit was organizing a reunion for everyone who had returned from the mission. He immediately declined the invitation. Claire noticed him deleting the email. You don't have to go if you're not ready, she said gently. I'll never be ready. That answer stayed with her. Later that week, Claire stopped by a small bookstore after work. She wasn't looking for novels. She searched the shelves until she found books written by veterans who had struggled after returning home. That evening, she left one on the coffee table without saying anything. Ethan noticed it but walked past. The next day the book had moved. By the weekend it was gone. Claire found it upstairs with a bookmark halfway through. She smiled. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a beginning. One Sunday afternoon the doorbell rang. Standing outside was a middle-aged man in a military jacket. My name is Owen Brooks, he said. I served with Ethan. Claire welcomed him inside. When Ethan walked into the living room and saw Owen, he froze. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Owen stepped forward and hugged him. I've been trying to visit for months, Owen said. I wasn't ready to see anyone, Ethan admitted. I know. They spent hours talking in the backyard. Claire stayed inside, giving them privacy. As the sun began to set, she heard something she hadn't heard in a very long time. Ethan laughed. It wasn't loud. It didn't last long. But it was real. That evening, Owen left behind an old military photograph. It showed the entire squad standing together before their final mission. 12 soldiers. Young. Smiling. Full of confidence. Ethan stared at the picture for a long time. Then he pointed to a young man standing in the front row. That's Mason. Claire looked closely. He looks so young. So full of life, she whispered. Ethan nodded. He talked about his daughter every single day. He kept a drawing she made inside his vest. Claire remained silent. After a long pause, Ethan said something he had never admitted before. I've never visited his family. Claire looked at him in surprise. Why not? Because I don't know how to face them. What if they blame me? What if they're right? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Claire reached for his hand. You'll never know until you meet them. Ethan looked out the window toward the fading sunset. For the first time, instead of avoiding the past, he quietly began thinking about facing it. For the next several days, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Mason's family. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered Mason talking about his wife, Hannah, and their little daughter, Lily. He remembered the photos Mason kept in his pocket. He remembered the promise he had made before the deployment. If anything ever happens to me, Mason had joked one evening, make sure my girls know I never stopped talking about them. At the time, everyone laughed. No one believed those words would ever matter. Now they haunted Ethan every day. One Saturday morning, Claire found him standing in the garage, staring at his truck keys. I think I'm ready, he said quietly. She knew exactly what he meant. The drive took nearly 4 hours. Neither of them spoke very much. As they entered the small town where Mason's family lived, Ethan's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Claire gently placed her hand over his. You don't have to carry this alone. He nodded, but his heartbeat refused to slow down. They finally stopped in front of a modest white house with a swing on the porch. Children's toys were scattered across the front yard. For several minutes, Ethan couldn't bring himself to get out of the truck. I can't do this, he whispered. Claire looked at him. Yes, you can. He slowly stepped outside. Each step toward the front door felt heavier than the last. Before he could knock, the door opened. A little girl with bright brown eyes stood there holding a stuffed rabbit. She couldn't have been older than 5. She looked up at Ethan with innocent curiosity. Mom, she called. Someone's here. A woman appeared behind her. For a moment, neither she nor Ethan said a word. Then recognition filled her eyes. Captain Calloway? Ethan lowered his head. Mrs. Reed. I've wanted to come here for a long time. I just didn't know how. Hannah looked at him quietly before opening the door wider. You came. It wasn't anger. It wasn't blame. Just 2 simple words. Claire stayed near the porch while Ethan walked inside. The living room walls were covered with family photographs. There were pictures of Mason in uniform, Mason fishing with Lily, Mason holding her the day she was born. Every photo reminded Ethan of the man he couldn't bring home. Lily climbed onto the sofa beside him. Were you Daddy's friend? Ethan's voice almost disappeared. Yes. He said soldiers always take care of each other. Ethan felt tears filling his eyes. We tried. The little girl smiled. I still tell everyone my daddy is a hero. Ethan looked away, unable to hide his emotions. A few minutes later, Hannah returned carrying a small wooden box. I've been waiting years to give this to you. She placed it in Ethan's hands. Inside was a folded letter. On the front, written in Mason's handwriting, were just a few words. For Captain Ethan Calloway. Ethan stared at the envelope. His hands began to tremble. He had never seen it before. Slowly, he unfolded the letter. Ethan unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The paper had yellowed slightly with time, but Mason's handwriting was as clear as the day it had been written. Captain, if you're reading this, it means things didn't go the way either of us hoped. Ethan stopped for a moment, struggling to breathe. He continued reading. I know the kind of man you are. If something happens to me, you're going to blame yourself. So let me save you one last time. Tears rolled down Ethan's face. No leader wins every battle. Every decision we made out there was to protect each other. If my journey ends before yours, don't carry my death for the rest of your life. Carry my friendship instead. Ethan could barely see the page through his tears. Go home to Claire. Laugh again. Build the family you've always wanted. Promise me you won't let one terrible day erase every good day that comes after it. The letter ended with one final sentence. If anyone is responsible for my daughter growing up without her father, it's War. Not you. Ethan lowered the letter and covered his face with his hands. For 14 months, he had carried a burden that Mason himself had never wanted him to carry. Hannah sat across from him in silence. I found that letter with the rest of his belongings, she said softly. I couldn't bring myself to mail it. I thought, one day you'd come. Claire watched from the other side of the room, quietly wiping away tears. After several minutes, Ethan looked at Hannah. I've wanted to apologize to you every single day. She slowly shook her head. My husband believed in you. So do I. Ethan stared at her, unable to speak. Hannah smiled sadly. You brought 11 families their husbands home. My family wasn't one of them. But I refused to spend the rest of my life blaming the man who risked everything trying to save mine. Those words lifted a weight Ethan had carried for far too long. Before leaving, Lily ran toward him with the stuffed rabbit still tucked under her arm. Will you come visit us again? Ethan knelt until they were eye level. If your mom says it's okay. Lily threw her arms around his neck before he could finish. Claire smiled as she watched the moment unfold. For the first time since Ethan had returned from war, she saw something different in his eyes. The guilt was still there. The memories were still there. But for the first time, so was hope. The drive home felt different. For the first time in months, neither Claire nor Ethan was afraid of the silence. It was no longer filled with distance. It was filled with understanding. Halfway home, Ethan pulled into a small roadside diner. Claire looked at him in surprise. You haven't wanted to stop anywhere since you came home. Ethan gave a faint smile. I know. They ordered coffee and shared a slice of apple pie. It wasn't a grand celebration. It was simply the first normal moment they had shared in a very long time. Claire noticed something she hadn't seen in months. When the waitress thanked Ethan for his service, he didn't lower his head or change the subject. He simply smiled and replied, Thank you. It was a small change. But to Claire, it meant everything. The following Monday, Ethan returned to the Veterans Recovery Center. This time, he walked through the front door with confidence. During the group session, everyone noticed the difference. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath. I've spent over a year believing I failed the people who trusted me. The room became silent. This weekend I met the family of the soldier I couldn't bring home. Several veterans looked up. I expected anger. I expected blame. Instead, they gave me forgiveness. An older veteran sitting across the room smiled. Sometimes, he said quietly, the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. Ethan nodded. I think I'm finally starting to understand that. After the meeting, the counselor asked if Ethan would consider helping newly returned soldiers who were struggling to adjust to civilian life. At first, he hesitated. What if I say the wrong thing? The counselor smiled. You don't need perfect words. You just need to be someone who understands. A week later, Ethan volunteered for his first mentoring session. The young soldier assigned to him was only 23. He had returned from deployment 3 months earlier and barely spoke to anyone. Ethan recognized the look in his eyes immediately. It was the same look he had seen every morning in his own mirror. Instead of giving advice, Ethan simply sat beside him. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, the young soldier broke the silence. Does it ever get easier? Ethan thought carefully before answering. The memories don't disappear. But you learn that you don't have to carry them alone. The young soldier looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since entering the room, he smiled. That evening, Ethan arrived home carrying a small paper bag from Claire's favorite bakery. She laughed as he placed it on the kitchen counter. What's the special occasion? He looked at her with a warmth she hadn't seen in a long time. There doesn't have to be one. I just wanted to make you smile. Claire realized that healing hadn't happened in a single dramatic moment. It had happened through dozens of small choices. One conversation, One visit. One act of forgiveness. One day at a time. And for the first time since the war had ended, their future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like something worth fighting for. 3 months passed. Life slowly found a new rhythm. Ethan continued mentoring veterans every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Claire noticed that he came home lighter than before. He still had difficult days, but they no longer lasted for weeks. One Saturday morning, they decided to repaint the old fence around their backyard. It was the first home project they had worked on together since Ethan returned. As they laughed over spilled paint and uneven brush strokes, Claire realized she had missed the sound of his laughter more than anything else. Later that afternoon, Ethan's phone rang. The caller ID showed the military headquarters. He answered immediately. After a few minutes, he thanked the officer and ended the call. Claire could tell something was wrong. What happened? They're offering me a promotion. Claire smiled. That's wonderful. Ethan looked out the window. It would mean returning to active duty. The smile slowly disappeared from Claire's face. Neither of them spoke for a long time. That evening, Ethan sat alone on the back porch, staring at the stars. Claire walked outside with 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one. You've always dreamed of serving your country for 20 years, she said. I know, but dreams can change. He sighed. I don't know if saying no makes me a coward. Claire shook her head. You've already proven your courage. You don't have to prove it again. The next morning, Ethan drove to the military base to meet his commanding officer. The general congratulated him on the promotion and placed the paperwork on the desk. You've earned this. Ethan looked at the documents for several seconds. Then he quietly pushed them back. I'm grateful for everything the Army has given me. But it's time for someone else to lead. The general studied him carefully. You've made your decision? Ethan nodded. For years, I believed my only purpose was wearing this uniform. He smiled softly. Now I know my purpose is helping the men and women who take it off. The general stood up, walked around the desk, and shook Ethan's hand. Captain Calloway, the Army needs soldiers. He paused. But it also needs leaders who know when their next mission is at home. As Ethan walked out of the headquarters, he took one last look at the flag flying above the building. He felt pride. Not because he was leaving, but because he knew he had served with honor. That evening, he surprised Claire with a small wooden frame. Inside was a photograph from the day they were married. He hung it in the living room. Claire smiled. You finally unpacked it. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. I spent too long looking at the past. He looked at the photograph. I don't want to miss the future. Claire rested her head against his shoulder. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful. Not because every wound had healed, but because they had finally stopped fighting them alone. 6 months after Ethan declined the promotion, life became quieter than either of them expected. The nightmares still came once in a while, but they no longer controlled every night. Claire had learned not to wake him immediately. Instead, she would gently hold his hand until he realized where he was. Safe. Home. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan was organizing old boxes in the attic when he found a dusty photo album. It was filled with pictures from the early years of their marriage. Weekend road trips. Camping in the mountains. Late-night ice cream runs. Birthday parties with friends. Claire climbed the attic stairs carrying 2 cups of coffee. What did you find? Ethan smiled as he turned another page. I forgot how much we used to travel. Claire laughed. You were always the one who insisted on taking the longest route, so we could see more. He closed the album and looked at her. When was the last time we went anywhere just because we wanted to? She thought for a moment. I honestly can't remember. The next weekend, they packed a few bags and drove toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. No schedules. No phone calls. No military meetings. Just the 2 of them. They rented a small cabin overlooking a quiet lake. The air smelled of pine trees and fresh rain. For the first time in years, Ethan slept through the entire night. On the second evening, They sat around a campfire watching the flames dance in the darkness. Claire looked across the fire. "I've been wanting to ask you something." Ethan nodded. "Were you ever afraid I would leave?" He stared into the fire for several seconds. "Every day." Claire frowned. "Why?" "Because I wasn't the man you married when I came home." She moved closer. "No, you weren't." Ethan lowered his eyes. Claire reached for his hand. "You became someone who had been through unimaginable pain." She smiled softly. "And I married you for better or worse." That promise didn't expire when life became difficult. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "I don't think I've ever thanked you." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." He looked directly into her eyes. "You stayed when I gave you every reason to walk away." Claire smiled through tears. "I stayed because I never stopped seeing the man behind the pain." The following morning, before leaving the cabin, Ethan took a small pocket knife from his backpack. On an old wooden bench overlooking the lake, he carefully carved 2 initials inside a simple heart. Claire laughed. "That's something teenagers do." "Maybe." He smiled. "But I think we deserve a fresh beginning." Years from now, strangers would sit on that same bench without knowing who carved those letters. But for Ethan and Claire, it marked the place where they finally stopped measuring their lives by the war and started measuring them by the days they still had together. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Snow covered the rooftops, and the town prepared for the holidays. For the first time since returning home, Ethan helped Claire decorate the house. He climbed the ladder to hang lights along the porch while Claire untangled strings of ornaments that had been packed away for years. "You missed a spot," she called, laughing. "I did that on purpose," Ethan replied with a grin. "So you'll have an excuse to come outside and keep me company." Claire smiled. It was the kind of playful conversation she had prayed would return. A week before Christmas, Ethan received another phone call from the Veterans Recovery Center. One of the younger veterans he had been mentoring, Logan Pierce, had stopped attending meetings. No one had been able to reach him. Without hesitation, Ethan drove to Logan's apartment. After knocking several times, the door finally opened. Logan looked exhausted. The apartment was dark. The curtains were closed. Takeout boxes covered the kitchen counter. "I figured you'd stop by eventually," Logan said quietly. Ethan stepped inside. "I wasn't coming as your mentor. I'm here as someone who knows what it feels like to shut everyone out." For nearly an hour they talked. Not about medals. Not about missions. Just about life after the uniform. When Ethan finally stood to leave, Logan spoke. "I thought nobody would notice if I disappeared." Ethan looked him in the eye. "I noticed. And next time, don't wait for me to knock. Call me." Logan nodded. "I will." That evening, Ethan returned home later than expected. Claire was waiting with 2 bowls of hot soup. She listened as he told her about Logan. When he finished, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You saved another soldier today." Ethan shook his head. "No. I reminded him that someone cared." Claire smiled. "Sometimes that's exactly what saves people." A few days later, the Veterans Recovery Center held its annual holiday gathering. Dozens of military families filled the room. Children laughed as they decorated cookies. Veterans shared stories that only they could truly understand. Near the end of the evening, the director stepped onto the stage. "I'd like to recognize someone who has made an extraordinary difference this year." Ethan immediately looked down, hoping it wasn't him. It was. The room erupted in applause as his name was announced. He reluctantly walked to the front. The director handed him a small plaque. "It doesn't recognize what you did during the war." He paused. "It recognizes what you've done since coming home." Ethan looked across the room. Claire stood in the back, smiling with tears in her eyes. For the first time in years, he accepted the applause without guilt. Because this time, it wasn't about surviving the battlefield. It was about helping others survive life after it. As they drove home through the falling snow, Claire rested her hand on Ethan's. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Some journeys aren't measured by the distance you've traveled. They're measured by the person you've become when you finally find your way home. Spring arrived with warm sunshine and blooming flowers. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Ethan and Claire felt as though life was finally moving forward instead of standing still. The house that had once felt painfully quiet was now filled with laughter again. On Saturday mornings, Ethan made pancakes while Claire watered the flowers in the backyard. On Sunday evenings, they took long walks through the neighborhood without saying much. Neither of them needed perfect words anymore. Simply being together was enough. One afternoon, Claire received an unexpected phone call from the Veterans Recovery Center. The director had a special request. "We're opening a new family support program for military couples," he explained. "We'd like Ethan and Claire to be our first guest speakers." Claire smiled. "I'll ask him." That evening, she mentioned it over dinner. Ethan immediately shook his head. "I'm not good at speeches." "You don't have to give a speech," Claire replied. "You just have to tell the truth." A week later, they stood together in front of nearly 100 military families. Some soldiers had just returned home. Others were preparing to deploy. Many couples looked exactly the way Ethan and Claire had looked 2 years earlier. Hopeful, but uncertain. Ethan stepped toward the microphone. For a moment, the room was completely silent. "I used to believe courage only existed on the battlefield," he began. "I was wrong." He looked at Claire. "The bravest person I've ever known never carried a weapon." Several people in the audience turned toward her. "When I came home, I pushed everyone away. I thought protecting my wife meant making her leave." Claire quietly reached for his hand. "But she stayed. She reminded me that healing isn't something you have to earn. It's something you're allowed to accept." Many people in the audience wiped away tears. When Ethan finished speaking, the room stood and applauded. Not because he had been a decorated officer, but because he had spoken with honesty. After the event, a young military wife approached Claire. "My husband came home 3 months ago," she said. "I've been feeling so alone." Claire hugged her gently. "You're not alone. There are more people who understand than you realize." Months later, the support program continued to grow. Military families from across the state began attending. Some arrived feeling hopeless. Many left believing their marriages could survive. One warm summer evening, Ethan and Claire returned to the airport where everything had begun. Planes landed in the distance as another group of soldiers walked through the arrival gates. Families ran forward with tears of joy. Claire looked at Ethan. "Do you remember the day you came home?" He nodded. "I thought my life had ended." She smiled softly. "No. It was just beginning." Ethan wrapped his arm around her as they watched another family reunite after months apart. He finally understood something that had taken years to learn. Coming home from war wasn't the end of his story. Learning how to live again was. As they walked back to their car, hand in hand, the evening sun disappeared below the horizon. For the first time since his final deployment, Ethan wasn't thinking about the war. He was thinking about tomorrow. And for the first time in a long time, tomorrow felt like a gift. 2 years passed. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Ethan continued mentoring veterans, while Claire volunteered with military spouses whose partners were deployed overseas. One afternoon, Claire was organizing paperwork when she found an old notebook Ethan had kept from his army days. Inside were pages filled with goals he had written years before. Some had already come true. Others had been crossed out. One sentence, however, caught her attention. "One day, I want to build a place where every returning soldier knows they are not alone." That evening, Claire placed the notebook on the kitchen table. "You never told me about this." Ethan smiled as he looked at the faded handwriting. "I wrote that during my second deployment. I thought it was impossible." Claire closed the notebook and looked at him. "Maybe it isn't." The idea stayed with them for weeks. Every night after dinner they talked about it. They weren't wealthy. They didn't have investors. They didn't even know where to begin. But they believed in the idea. Several months later, they rented a small office on the edge of town. The paint was peeling from the walls. The furniture came from thrift stores. The coffee machine barely worked. Still, Ethan looked around the empty room and smiled. It isn't much. Claire laughed. It's enough to start. They called it Home Front Haven. Their mission was simple: to help veterans and their families rebuild their lives after military service. At first, only a few people came through the doors. Some needed career advice. Others simply wanted someone to listen. Word slowly spread. Within a year, the little office became too small. Local businesses donated furniture. Retired veterans volunteered their time. Mental health professionals offered free counseling sessions every month. One afternoon, Ethan noticed a familiar face walking through the entrance. It was Logan Pierce, the young veteran he had once mentored. He was wearing a suit instead of military boots. "I heard you were looking for volunteers," Logan said with a smile. Ethan shook his hand. "I was hoping you'd come." Logan looked around the busy center. "You know." He smiled. "You didn't just help me. You inspired me to help someone else." Ethan glanced toward Claire across the room. She was comforting the wife of a deployed Marine, reminding her that she wasn't facing the journey alone. He realized something that brought a smile to his face. Years earlier, he had believed his purpose ended when he took off the uniform. Now he understood the truth. His greatest service to others had only begun after he came home. As the center closed for the evening, Ethan locked the front door and looked up at the sign above the entrance. For a moment, he remembered the broken man who had stepped off the plane years ago. If someone had told him then that one day he would spend his life helping others find hope, he never would have believed it. Claire slipped her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan smiled. "I'm thinking about how one act of kindness can change an entire life." Claire looked at the busy building behind them. "And sometimes," she smiled back, "it changes hundreds." 3 years after opening Home Front Haven, Ethan and Claire hardly recognized how much their lives had changed. What had started as a tiny office with second-hand furniture had grown into a place where dozens of military families gathered every week. Some came looking for advice. Some came looking for work. Others simply came because they needed someone who understood. One rainy afternoon, a young Army wife named Rachel Dawson walked through the front door carrying a sleeping baby. She looked exhausted. Her husband had been deployed overseas for almost 9 months. "I don't know why I'm here," she admitted. "I just don't want to feel alone anymore." Claire smiled warmly. "Then you've come to the right place." Over the next few weeks, Rachel became a regular visitor. She helped organize events, served coffee, and made friends with other military spouses. For the first time in months, she laughed again. One evening, Ethan noticed her staring at a wall covered with photographs of veterans and their families. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Rachel pointed to one empty space in the center. "It looks like something's missing." Ethan smiled. "It is." "What?" "A picture that reminds people why this place exists." A month later, the community organized a Family Appreciation Day. Hundreds of veterans, spouses, children, and volunteers gathered outside the center. There were food trucks, live music, games for children, and speeches from local leaders. Near the end of the afternoon, the mayor stepped onto the stage. "I have one more surprise." He uncovered a bronze plaque mounted near the entrance. It read, "Home Front Haven, built on courage, strengthened by hope, and inspired by the belief that no military family should ever face the journey alone." Below the inscription were 2 names. Captain Ethan Calloway, Claire Whitmore. The crowd applauded. Ethan stood speechless. He had never wanted recognition. He had only wanted to make sure no veteran felt as isolated as he once had. Claire looked at him and whispered, "You earned this." He shook his head. "We earned this." That evening, after everyone had gone home, Ethan and Claire sat quietly on the front steps of the center. The parking lot was empty. The lights inside had been turned off. Only the sign above the entrance remained illuminated. Claire leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder. "Remember the day you came home from deployment?" He nodded. I thought the hardest battle was behind me. She smiled. It wasn't. No. He looked at the building they had created together. It was learning how to live again. Claire reached for his hand. And you did. As they sat beneath the evening sky, Ethan realized something he had never understood during his years in uniform. A soldier's greatest legacy isn't measured only by the battles he fights. Sometimes it's measured by the lives he helps rebuild long after the war is over. A quiet Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Homefront Haven. A black SUV pulled into the parking lot, and a man in his late 60s stepped out wearing an old army jacket. His hair was gray, but his posture was unmistakably military. He introduced himself as General Victor Lawson Rhett. I've heard a lot about this place, he said as he shook Ethan's hand. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. Ethan gave him a tour of the building. They walked through the counseling rooms, the career center, the family lounge, and the children's play area. The retired general stopped in front of a wall covered with handwritten thank you notes from veterans and their families. He read every single one without speaking. After a long silence, he turned to Ethan. I've commanded thousands of soldiers. I've received medals from presidents. But I've learned something today. Ethan waited. The greatest leaders aren't always found on the battlefield. They're found in places like this. Those words stayed with Ethan long after the visit ended. A few weeks later, the center received a letter from a military foundation. They had been selected for a national award recognizing organizations that made an extraordinary difference in the lives of veterans and military families. The ceremony would be held in Washington. Ethan almost declined the invitation. Claire laughed. You're not skipping this one. I don't like standing on stages. I know. But this time, you're not accepting an award for yourself. You're accepting it for everyone who walked through those doors believing they had no one left. A month later, they traveled to the ceremony. Representatives from veteran organizations across the country filled the ballroom. When Homefront Haven was announced as the winner, the audience stood and applauded. Ethan slowly walked to the podium. He looked around the room before speaking. I spent years believing strength meant never asking for help. He paused. I was wrong. The strongest people I've ever met were the ones brave enough to admit they were struggling. He looked toward Claire. And the strongest family member I've ever known is my wife. If she had given up on me. He smiled. None of this would exist today. The room became completely silent. Many people wiped away tears. When the applause finally ended, Ethan stepped away from the microphone and returned to his seat. Claire quietly slipped her hand into his. You did great. He smiled. I wasn't nervous. You weren't. I just kept looking at you. That evening, as they flew home, Ethan looked out the airplane window at the clouds below. Years earlier, he had returned from war believing his story was over. Now he understood something completely different. Sometimes the hardest chapter in life becomes the one that inspires everyone else. And for the first time, he no longer saw himself as a broken soldier. He saw himself as a husband, a mentor, and a man who had finally found peace. Nearly 5 years had passed since Ethan returned from his final deployment. Homefront Haven had become more than a veterans center. It had become a second home for hundreds of military families. Every Friday evening, veterans gathered around a long wooden table in the community room. There were no speeches, no uniforms, no ranks. Just coffee, homemade food, and honest conversations. One Friday, a young soldier named Noah Carter walked through the front door. He had been discharged only 2 weeks earlier. He barely spoke. He avoided eye contact with everyone. Ethan recognized the look immediately. It was the same look he had seen in his own reflection years ago. Instead of asking Noah questions, Ethan simply handed him a cup of coffee. You don't have to talk today, he said. You can just sit with us. Noah nodded. For the next hour, he listened as other veterans shared stories about rebuilding their lives. No one interrupted. No one judged. When the meeting ended, Noah quietly approached Ethan. I thought I was the only one who felt this way. Ethan smiled. So did I. The following weeks brought more people through the doors. Some had served in the Army, others in the Navy, Air Force, Marines, or National Guard. Different uniforms, different missions, but the same invisible wounds. One afternoon, Claire walked into Ethan's office carrying a stack of letters. These arrived today. They were thank you letters from military families across the country. One came from a widow whose husband had been killed overseas. Another came from a veteran who had found a job after months of unemployment. One letter was written in colorful crayon by a little boy. It simply said, "Thank you for helping my dad smile again." Ethan stared at the page for several seconds before carefully folding it and placing it inside his desk drawer. "I think this one's staying with me." Claire smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Later that evening, as they prepared to close the center, Noah returned. This time he wasn't alone. He had brought another recently discharged soldier. "I told him this is the first place where I felt understood," Noah said. Ethan looked around the room. Years earlier, he had walked into a recovery center believing no one could understand his pain. Now, without realizing it, he had become the reason others walked through the door. Before leaving, Noah turned back. "Captain." Ethan smiled. "You don't have to call me Captain anymore." Noah shook his head. "I know. But you'll always be the officer who taught me that asking for help isn't weakness." As the lights were turned off that night, Claire looked at Ethan and whispered, "You remember the man who stepped off that plane all those years ago?" Ethan nodded. "Barely." She smiled. "I'm glad. Because the man standing here today is someone he would be proud to become." Ethan looked around the quiet building one last time before locking the front door. For years, he had believed his greatest accomplishment was surviving the war. Now he knew the truth. His greatest accomplishment was helping others believe that life after war was still worth living. 7 years passed. The seasons changed, new families arrived, and others moved on with their lives, but Homefront Haven never stopped growing. Every wall inside the building held a story. Photographs of reunions, letters from grateful families, drawings made by children whose parents had finally come home. One autumn morning, Ethan unlocked the front door as he always did. Before he could switch on the lights, he noticed a young boy sitting on the front steps. The child looked no older than 10. He wore an oversized hoodie and held an old military cap tightly against his chest. Ethan crouched beside him. "Good morning." The boy looked up nervously. "My name is Aiden Foster. I'm looking for Captain Ethan Calloway." Ethan smiled gently. "You found him." The boy stood up. "My dad told me to give this to you." He handed Ethan a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Captain, you probably don't remember me. My name is Daniel Foster. We met 3 years ago after I left the Army. I was angry, lost, and convinced my family deserved a better man than me. You told me something I'll never forget. You said my children didn't need a perfect father. They just needed a father who refused to stop trying. I listened. Today I own a small construction company. My marriage survived. My children know me as the dad who never misses a baseball game. None of that would have happened if you hadn't taken the time to sit beside a stranger and simply listen. My son wanted to meet the man who changed our family's future." By the time Ethan finished reading, his eyes were filled with tears. He looked at Aiden. "Your dad did the hard work." The boy smiled. "He says you helped him believe he could." Claire had quietly walked into the lobby during the conversation. She watched as Ethan gave the letter back to Aiden. "Keep this," Ethan said. "One day your dad will tell you the whole story, and you'll understand how strong he really is." Before leaving, Aiden reached into his backpack and pulled out a small wooden plaque. His father had carved the words by hand. "One conversation can change a life." Ethan ran his fingers across the wood without saying a word. After the boy left, Claire looked at him. "You've received awards. You've received medals. You've received recognition from people you'll never meet again." She smiled. "But I don't think any of them compare to that." Ethan looked through the front window as Aiden climbed into his father's truck. Daniel waved before driving away. Ethan waved back. Then he quietly hung the wooden plaque above the entrance to his office. Every veteran who walked through that door would see those 5 words before sitting down. One conversation can change a life. Years earlier, Ethan believed he had returned home carrying only pain. He never imagined that one day, the same voice that once struggled to ask for help would become the voice that helped so many others find hope. 10 years had passed since Ethan returned from his final deployment. The scars of war had never completely disappeared, but they no longer controlled his life. Homefront Haven had grown into one of the most respected veteran support organizations in the state. One quiet Monday morning, Claire noticed Ethan standing in front of an old storage cabinet. He was holding the first military medal he had received after returning home. The same medal he had once hidden away in a kitchen drawer. "You haven't looked at that in years," Claire said. Ethan smiled. "I wasn't ready before." He carefully placed the medal inside a glass display case near the entrance of the center. A small plaque sat beneath it. It didn't list his rank. It didn't mention his achievements. It simply read, "This medal doesn't belong to one soldier. It belongs to every family that waited, prayed, and welcomed someone home." Visitors stopped to read it every day. Many military spouses quietly wiped away tears. One afternoon, Ethan received an invitation from the Army Academy. They wanted him to speak to a graduating class of young officers preparing for their first deployment. At first he declined. "I've spent enough time behind podiums." Claire smiled. "But they've never heard your story." A month later, Ethan stood in front of nearly 500 young officers dressed in freshly pressed uniforms. They looked exactly as he had looked years earlier. Confident, determined, ready to change the world. Ethan stepped to the microphone. "When I graduated, I believed leadership meant having all the answers." He paused. "I've learned something different. Leadership is admitting when you're hurting. It's asking for help before pride becomes isolation. It's remembering that every soldier has a family waiting for them." The auditorium became completely silent. He continued, "When you deploy, you'll train for every possible mission. But no one will teach you how to come home." He glanced toward Claire, who was sitting in the front row. "When that day comes, let the people who love you help carry the weight." After the ceremony ended, dozens of young officers lined up to shake his hand. One lieutenant stopped before leaving. "My fiancée was worried about military life. I'm taking her to meet your wife." Claire laughed. "I'd be happy to meet her." Months later, more military families began visiting Homefront Haven after hearing Ethan's speech. The center expanded once again, adding a library, classrooms, and a family counseling wing. One evening, Ethan and Claire walked through the quiet halls after everyone had gone home. The walls that had once been empty were now covered with photographs of smiling families, children, reunions, and handwritten notes. Claire looked around and smiled. "Do you know what my favorite part of this building is?" Ethan looked at her. "What?" "There isn't a single picture of someone standing alone." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "That's exactly how it should be." As they switched off the lights and locked the front door, Ethan looked back one last time. Years ago, he believed the war had taken everything from him. Now he understood that healing had given him something even greater. A chance to spend the rest of his life making sure no soldier ever had to fight the hardest battle alone. 15 years after Ethan returned home, Homefront Haven had become a place known far beyond their hometown. People traveled from different states to attend its programs. Some came because they had heard Ethan speak. Others came because someone they trusted had simply said, "If you're struggling, go there." One chilly October morning, Ethan arrived earlier than usual. As he unlocked the front door, he noticed a young Army officer standing outside with a duffel bag over his shoulder. The officer looked nervous. "My name is Lieutenant Ryan Mercer," he said. "I've been ordered to deploy in 3 weeks." Ethan shook his hand. "Come inside." Ryan looked around the center before speaking. "My father told me to find you." Ethan frowned. "Who's your father?" Ryan smiled. Logan Pierce. For a moment, Ethan was speechless. He remembered the frightened young veteran who had once believed no one would notice if he disappeared. Now his son was wearing the same uniform. "It's hard to believe," Ethan said with a smile. "I remember when your father walked through these doors." Ryan laughed. "He tells that story every Veterans Day." They spent the next 2 hours talking. Ryan asked about leadership, about fear, about responsibility. Finally, he asked the one question that had been on his mind all morning. "Were you ever scared before a mission?" Ethan smiled honestly. "Every single time." Ryan looked surprised. "I thought officers weren't supposed to admit that. The brave ones do." He leaned forward. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do the right thing even when fear is sitting beside you." Ryan quietly nodded. Before leaving, Ethan handed him a small notebook. Its leather cover had faded with age. "I carried this during my final deployment." Ryan carefully opened it. Most of the pages were filled with handwritten notes, quotes, maps, reminders. On the final page, one sentence was written in bold letters. "Never forget the people waiting for you at home." Ryan looked up. "I'll take care of it." "I know you will." 3 weeks later, Ryan deployed overseas. Every month he sent Ethan a handwritten letter. Not about military operations. Not about danger. But about the people serving beside him. The friendships they built. The families they missed. 1 year later, Ryan returned home safely. The first place he visited wasn't his old high school. It wasn't the military base. It was Homefront Haven. He walked through the front door still wearing his uniform. Without saying a word, he handed Ethan the same notebook. "I think someone else will need it one day." Ethan smiled. The notebook had completed another journey, just as Hope had. Claire watched the exchange from across the room. She realized that Homefront Haven was no longer just a place. It had become a legacy, a place where one generation of soldiers quietly prepared the next, not only to serve their country, but to find their way home again. 20 years had passed since Ethan stepped off that plane believing he had lost himself forever. His hair had turned gray. The lines on his face had deepened. But whenever he walked through the doors of Homefront Haven, the same warm smile greeted every veteran who arrived. One quiet afternoon, Claire found him sitting alone in the library, looking through a large scrapbook. Inside were photographs collected over the years. Families reunited at airports. Children hugging parents in uniform. Veterans celebrating new jobs. Couples renewing their wedding vows after surviving years of separation. Claire sat beside him. "You've looked at that book 3 times this week." Ethan smiled. "I'm afraid I'll forget their names." She gently closed the scrapbook. "You won't. They're part of your life now." Just then the front desk called. "There are visitors here to see you." When Ethan walked into the lobby, he stopped in surprise. Nearly 30 veterans were standing there with their spouses and children. Some had traveled hundreds of miles. Others had flown in from different states. Logan was there. Noah was there. Daniel Foster stood beside his wife and son. Ryan Mercer had brought his fiancée. Even Hannah Reed and Lily had made the trip. Lily was no longer a little girl. She was a confident young woman studying nursing at college. She walked over and hugged Ethan. "You kept your promise." Ethan looked confused. "What promise?" "You told me you'd come back." "And you did. Every birthday. Every graduation. Every Christmas card. You never let us feel forgotten." Ethan smiled, holding back tears. "I couldn't." The room filled with laughter as everyone shared old memories. Later that afternoon, Logan stood and tapped a spoon against his coffee mug. "I think it's time." 2 veterans carried in a large wooden box. Ethan looked at Claire, completely puzzled. "What is this?" "Open it," she said with a smile. Inside was a bronze sculpture. It showed a soldier walking toward home. Beside him stood his wife, reaching for his hand. At the base of the sculpture was a simple inscription. "Some heroes save lives in battle. Others save them after the battle is over." Captain Ethan Calloway and Claire Whitmore, thank you for bringing us home. The room fell silent. Ethan stared at the sculpture for several seconds before turning toward everyone gathered around him. I don't deserve this. Hannah smiled. Maybe not. But every person in this room believes you do. Claire slipped her hand into his. This isn't about medals. It's about lives. Ethan looked around the room. 20 years earlier, he believed his story would always be defined by the soldier he couldn't save. Now he realized something beautiful. His life had been defined instead by the countless people he had helped stand again. As the evening came to an end, the sculpture was placed in the entrance of Homefront Haven. Every person who walked through those doors would see it. Not as a reminder of war, but as proof that healing is possible when no one has to walk the journey alone. 25 years had passed since Ethan returned from his final deployment. Homefront Haven had become a place where hope lived. Every morning, before anyone else arrived, Ethan walked through each room, turned on the lights, and made a fresh pot of coffee. It had become his favorite part of the day. One Monday morning, he noticed a young woman standing outside the entrance before sunrise. She looked nervous, holding a folder tightly against her chest. When Ethan opened the door, she smiled politely. My name is Emma Reed. For a moment, Ethan couldn't place the name. Then she smiled again. My mother is Lily Reed. Ethan's eyes widened. The little girl with the stuffed rabbit? Emma laughed. My grandmother still tells that story. Ethan invited her inside. As they sat together, Emma carefully opened the folder. I've just been accepted into medical school. Congratulations. She nodded. I came here because I wanted you to be the first person outside my family to know. Ethan looked surprised. Why me? Emma reached into the folder and pulled out an old photograph. It showed Ethan standing beside Hannah and little Lily on the day of his first visit. My mom says that after my grandfather died, you never disappeared from their lives. You came to birthdays. You helped Grandma fix things around the house. You taught Mom how to drive. You even cried at her wedding. Ethan laughed quietly. I did. Emma smiled. She always says I probably wouldn't exist if you had allowed guilt to control the rest of your life. Those words left Ethan speechless. Years ago, he believed meeting Mason's family would reopen old wounds. Instead, they had become part of his own family. Later that afternoon, Emma asked if she could see the bronze sculpture in the lobby. She stood in front of it for several minutes. My grandfather would have been proud of you. Ethan looked at the floor. I hope so. Emma gently shook her head. You don't have to hope. He already was. Before leaving, she handed Ethan a white envelope. Inside was an invitation. She was graduating at the top of her class and wanted him and Claire to sit in the family section during the ceremony. When Claire read the invitation that evening, tears filled her eyes. We're really becoming grandparents to half this town. Ethan laughed. It certainly feels that way. Several weeks later, they attended Emma's graduation. As she crossed the stage to receive her diploma, she paused for a moment. Instead of walking directly back to her seat, she stepped down from the stage and hugged Ethan first. The audience applauded. Most people assumed he was her grandfather. Neither Ethan nor Claire corrected them. Because family isn't always created by blood. Sometimes it's created by loyalty, by forgiveness, and by choosing to stay in someone's life long after the hardest chapter has ended. 30 years had passed since Captain Ethan Calloway stepped off the military plane believing the war had taken the best years of his life. Now at 71, he walked a little slower. His hair had turned completely white. But every morning, he still unlocked the doors of Homefront Haven before anyone else arrived. Claire always joked that he would probably keep working until someone physically took the keys away. One spring morning, Ethan pulled into the parking lot and noticed dozens of cars already parked outside. He frowned. We're closed today. Claire smiled without saying a word. I know. When they walked inside, every light in the building suddenly turned on. Surprise. The room erupted with applause. Veterans, military families, volunteers, old friends. Children who had grown into adults. Adults who now had children of their own. Nearly everyone whose life had crossed Ethan and Claire's over the past 3 decades had returned. Logan Pierce stood near the front with his grandchildren. Ryan Mercer arrived wearing the rank of colonel. Emma Reed had become one of the state's most respected trauma surgeons. Even Hannah Reed, now in her 70s, smiled through happy tears as she walked toward Ethan. "You still cry too easily," she teased. Ethan laughed. "I learned that from all of you." Near the center of the room stood a large wooden wall covered with hundreds of photographs. Every picture represented a family whose life had been touched by Homefront Haven. Airport reunions, graduations, weddings, birthday parties, retirement ceremonies, tiny babies held by parents who had once feared they would never come home. Claire quietly took Ethan's hand. "Look at the last picture." At the very center of the wall was the first photograph ever taken after Ethan returned from deployment. It showed a tired soldier standing beside the woman who had refused to give up on him. Below it was a single sentence. "Every journey home begins with one person who refuses to let go." The room fell silent. Ryan Mercer stepped forward. "Captain." Ethan smiled. "You know you don't have to call me Captain anymore." Ryan shook his head. "No. To us you'll always be Captain." He handed Ethan a small wooden box. Inside were thousands of handwritten notes collected over the years. Each note came from a veteran or a family member. Some were only one sentence. Others filled several pages. One note read, "Because of this place, my children grew up with a father who believed in tomorrow." Another said, "Your wife taught mine that loving a soldier also means learning how to carry hope." Ethan closed the box, unable to hold back his tears. He looked around the room. "I spent years believing my greatest responsibility was leading soldiers into battle." He paused. "I was wrong. My greatest responsibility began the day I came home." He turned toward Claire. "And I couldn't have done any of it without the woman who never stopped believing in me, even when I had stopped believing in myself." The room stood in applause. Claire wrapped her arms around Ethan, just as she had done the day he returned from war. Only this time, there was no fear, no silence, no distance, just peace. As the celebration came to an end, Ethan and Claire stepped outside together. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. They sat quietly on the bench outside Homefront Haven, watching families laugh in the parking lot. After a long silence, Claire smiled. "If you had the chance to live it all again, what would you change?" Ethan looked at the building that had become their life's work. He thought about the battles, the losses, the tears, the healing, the friendships, the thousands of lives forever connected by one decision to never give up. Then he looked at Claire and smiled. "Not a single day." She rested her head on his shoulder as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. Their story had never been about war. It had never been about medals. It had never been about recognition. It was about love that stayed when life became difficult, hope that refused to disappear, and two ordinary people who proved that sometimes the greatest victory isn't coming home from war. It's learning how to build a life worth living after you get there.